I once had a patient who, on learning that I was interested in Bible prophecy, shared with me her conviction that 666 meant Viagra. She gave me a copy of a lengthy manuscript she had worked on for several years, with very elaborate diagrams of the chemical structure of Viagra, with studies of the etymology of the name and the numerical correspondent of its 6 letters, and several other lines of evidence why it was a perfect fit for 666. One being the fact that 666 was the number of a man. A number of years ago, I had a nurse working for me that was convinced that POTUS number 44, who had just been inaugurated, was the Antichrist and 666. She was part of a group that shared this conviction, and they too had multiple evidences that proved they were correct. Hi, I'm Gilly, and as I promised you last time, today we will be focusing on setting up the basic framework for a correct interpretation of prophecy. This is a necessary and important step. It is necessary because prophecies are often given in code, using symbolic language or terms, and thus their meaning is not immediately apparent to the casual reader. And it is important for the obvious reason that if we don't use the appropriate deciphering tools, we cannot expect to arrive at the correct meaning. For the rest of this episode, I'm going to list 4 fundamental principles that I found to be essential for a correct interpretation of Bible prophecy. I chose only 4 to stay within an important framework many prophecies are built on, as we shall see. But the list is open, and I encourage you to post in the comments section below any other principles that you think are essential. I thank you in advance for your contribution, and while you're at it, make sure to subscribe to this channel, and don't forget the like button below either. You don't have to smash it, a gentle click is sufficient. The same is true about the notification button, by the way. Principle number 1. The Bible is the primary key for unlocking the meaning of prophecies. This is rather obvious, but it is so fundamental that I think it deserves to be at the top. Let me illustrate. You may have heard in the news recently about the recent discovery of a treasure chest valued at over $1 million, hidden about a decade ago in the Rocky Mountains by Forrest Fenn, an art dealer and author. Despite what some estimate to have been 500,000 people coming for many years through the Rockies from Montana to New Mexico, only one person was able to find the treasure, using clues from Fenn's writings, including a poem published in his 2010 autobiography, The Thrill of the Chase. The key for this person's success was going to the source. Bible prophecy is much more valuable and much more complex than Fenn's 24-line poem and his treasure chest. The only way we can hope to be blessed by its riches is by reading the whole Bible and using the keys it provides. This is the main reason, I believe, why there is so much confusion in Bible prophecy interpretation and understanding. Sometimes the prophet provides the key to some of the symbols used in a prophecy in a very straightforward fashion. And I'll give you an example that you can read in the Revelation chapter 17, verse 15. John says there, "The angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." So from this verse, we can safely surmise that whenever seas or waters are used as a key, as a symbol in a prophecy, it actually means groups of people, multitudes, nations, ethnic groups, and so forth. In other cases, the key to a symbolic term is harder to find. See, for example, Daniel 7, verse 2. "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea." Now, we may have a sense of what the great sea means from the previous text, but what are these 4 winds of heaven? Daniel does not provide us with an immediate key to their meaning. So we have to work a little bit harder to find it. And I'm not going to give it to you just yet. I'll cover this when we get to that specific section of the book of Daniel. But if somebody knows the key already, feel free to post it in the comment section below. In this context, I'm going to suggest a practical tip for the more serious student of prophecy among you. Start making a list of keys to prophetic symbols and their meaning. Again, I cannot overemphasize how important it is to let the Bible, not politics, not current events, not your imagination or other people's imagination, just let the Bible provide the keys for proper interpretation of its prophecies. Principle number 2, 1 prophetic day equals 1 calendar year. Prophecies have a lot to do with time and with the future. Here are a few well-known examples. The 2300 evenings and mornings of Daniel 8:14, or a time, times, and half a time of Daniel 7:25, or the 1260 days of Revelation 12 verse 6, or the 70 weeks of Daniel 9:24. So the basic question here is this: are these literal days and weeks or not? To find the answer, we have to keep in mind a couple of things. First, a lot of prophecies have a very clearly defined start in time. Many other prophecies have a very clear end point in time. But there are a few that have both a clear beginning and a clear end, and that can be easily verified from extra biblical sources. Let's examine for a moment a prophecy with both a clear start and clear end that we can easily define in historical time. And that is the 70 weeks prophecy concerning the coming of the Messiah from Daniel chapter 9. We can find the start in verse 24. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, we know from history that the decree to restore and build Jerusalem, as described in the text I just read, was issued in the year 457 before Christ. As a side note, we'll discuss this prophecy in a lot more detail in a future episode. Most Bible scholars agree that Jesus, the Messiah, that this prophecy talks about, started his public ministry in the year 27 AD. If we add 457 to 27, keeping in mind that there was no year 0, we can easily see that it took 483 literal years for this prophecy to go from start to finish. Yet Daniel states the same time interval as 7 plus 62, which is 69 weeks. If these were literal weeks, this is a false prophecy, as there was no Messiah that came a little bit over a year after 457 BC. But if we apply the principle 1 prophetic day equals 1 calendar year, then 69 weeks times 7 days in a week equals 483 years. We can see how this prophecy was fulfilled right on time over the span of almost half of a millennium. What a wonderful God we worship. Now you may ask, are there other Bible passages that support this day year, I should say, principle of prophetic interpretation? Yes, there are. Remember, for example, how the freshly liberated Israelite slaves ended up wandering in the desert for 40 full years and dying there, most of them at least, so that only their children entered the promised land. Why 40 years? Please read in chapter 14 of Numbers, verse 34, the following important text. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explore the land, you will suffer for your sins. So what God is telling the Israelites here is that for each day of the 40 days the spies explored the promised land, they will spend a whole year in the desert because they didn't have faith in God. This idea of a day for a year had been etched so profoundly in the Israelite ethos that many generations later, when Daniel was writing these prophecies, he didn't have to explain it to his readers. But for us today, we have to make a little extra effort to understand it and to get it right. And we have to familiarize ourselves with the larger context of the Bible. This in itself is another perfect illustration of the principle number 1 discussed earlier, where we said the Bible itself provides the keys to unlock the prophetic symbols. By the way, there are other places in the Bible where the day-year principle is present. Please take some time to read, for example, in their context, Genesis 29, verse 27, and Ezekiel 4, verse 6. It's really fascinating. Principle number 3. Prophecies are often given in multiple, overlapping, complementary parts. There is a clear pattern. Major Bible prophecies that span long periods of time of human history follow. First, a bare-bone version of the prophecy is given, outlining its major parts. Then, like an artist painting a complex scene, the author revisits the theme in greater and greater detail with subsequent touches that add depth, meaning, and context. For those of you familiar with scientific journals, it's somewhat similar to what you see when somebody publishes a journal, a study. First you see the abstract, and then comes the actual body of the study with its methods and findings and discussion. Failing to understand this principle can create huge headaches when trying to decipher some of the more difficult passages of the book of Revelation, for example. Now, you may ask, how do we know this principle is biblical? I mean, after all, how do you know I didn't just make it up? I would direct you to the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob in the Old Testament. Remember, when Joseph was a young man, he had 2 dreams that he shared with his family. You can read the whole story in Genesis chapter 37. First dream he had, he explained like this: we were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. In the second dream, the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowed down to me. Remember, Joseph had 11 brothers. Now, though his brothers took great offense at him, and he ended up being sold as a slave in Egypt, at least in part because of these dreams, Joseph lived to see his dreams come to a spectacular fulfillment. They must have stayed fresh in his mind, because years later, when he met Pharaoh's distressed cupbearer and baker in prison, he was able to interpret their dreams in a very accurate way. More importantly, 2 years later, when Pharaoh had a strange dream intended to alert him of 7 years of great abundance, followed by 7 years of famine, Joseph was again able to offer him a very accurate and immensely helpful interpretation. But there is an important detail in all of this. Pharaoh actually had 2 dreams. One about 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 skinny and ugly cows, and a second dream where 7 good, healthy heads of grain were swallowed by 7 thin, withered ones. Joseph prefaced the interpretation of the dreams by stating the very principle we're discussing here. He says to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And equally important, Joseph also told Pharaoh on the same occasion, the reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. We shall see many examples of prophecies that deal with the same events but are presented using different symbols, and we have to remember that they are one and the same. And the reason God chose to give them to us in these multiple variants is because their subject matter and outcome have been firmly decided by God. Principle number 4, some prophecies are conditional. These are prophecies whose fulfillment depended on the choices made by the people to whom they were addressed. I'll give you 2 examples. The first one in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 3 and 4. If ye walk in my statutes, and keep my commandments and do them. Then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield her fruit. Second example in Jeremiah 18, verses 7 through 10. And here God spells out this fourth principle in rather explicit detail. Listen to this, or read it with me. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down and destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do for it. Again, like with all the other principles, it is essential to discern which prophecies were conditional and which one were not. A good number of prophecies in the Old Testament regarding the bright future of the nation of Israel as a chosen people have not and will never become reality because of their disobedience. Failing to understand this fundamental principle can lead to a great deal of confusion, as we shall see later. So remember the four principles we discussed today. All keys to Bible prophecies are found in the Bible. One prophetic day equals one calendar year. Oftentimes Bible prophecies are given in overlapping forms. And number four, some prophecies were essential or conditional. In the next video, we'll start delving into the fascinating book of Daniel, the king of the Old Testament prophets. Until then, stay blessed and safe.